Story 1. The Watcher in the Window. It was a stormy night, the kind that makes you want to curl up with a blanket and forget about the world outside. But for Julie, there was no comfort to be found. She had recently moved into a small house in the countryside, hoping to escape the hustle of city life. The house had a certain charm, albeit a bit old, with creaky floors and windows that rattled in the wind. She dismissed these quirks as the house's age showing through. That is, until the first night the storm came. The rain was pelting against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. Julie was curled up on the couch with her book when she heard a soft tap on the glass. She looked up, startled. At first, she thought it was just the branches from the tree outside being blown against the window, but when she looked out, she saw nothing except darkness. Shrugging it off, she returned to her book. But then came another tap, louder this time, almost deliberate. Her heart raced as she stared at the window, her eyes straining to see through the rain-streaked glass. There, in the faint light from the street lamp outside, she saw a figure, a tall, shadowy figure standing just outside her window. Julie's breath caught in her throat. She stood up slowly, unsure of what to do. Was it a trick of the light? A wandering neighbor? But something about the way the figure stood motionless in the rain felt wrong, as if it was watching her. For several minutes, she stood frozen, her eyes locked on the shadowy figure. Then, in a blink, it was gone. Julie rushed to the window and peered outside, but the yard was empty. Shivering, she pulled the curtain shut and tried to calm her racing heart. Maybe it was just her imagination. That night, she slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of being watched. The next morning, the storm had passed, and she tried to convince herself that the figure had just been a trick of the shadows. But the next night, as the rain began to fall once more, the tapping returned. This time, Julie didn't ignore it. She went straight to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. There, once again, was the figure. Its outline was clearer now, tall and unnaturally still, standing in the same spot as the night before. Julie's stomach twisted with fear, but she forced herself to move closer to the window. As she approached, the figure seemed to move, slowly, as if shifting its weight. Julie pulled back the curtain with trembling hands. In the dim light, she could just make out its face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through her. She gasped and stumbled back, her heart thudding in her chest. But when she looked again, the figure was gone. Julie never saw the figure clearly after that, but every night she would hear the tapping, and every night she would feel the eyes watching her through the darkness, even though there was nothing there. She moved out a few weeks later, unable to bear the oppressive feeling of being watched any longer. To this day, she still wonders what, or who, had been standing outside her window, watching her in the rain. Story 2. The Phantom Hitchhiker. It was a cold, rainy night when Mark was driving home from a late shift at work. The road was slick with rain, and the dark clouds overhead seemed to smother the world in an eerie, quiet gloom. He was driving down a desolate stretch of highway with no other cars in sight. The only sound was the steady thrum of rain against his windshield. Suddenly, through the haze of his headlights, Mark saw a figure standing at the side of the road. It was a woman, drenched in rain, holding out her hand as if asking for a ride. She was wearing a white dress that clung to her soaked skin, and her hair hung down in long, dark strands. Mark slowed the car and pulled over beside her. The woman approached his window, and when she spoke, her voice was soft and pleading. "Can you give me a ride? I need to get home." She looked cold and miserable, and Mark, feeling sorry for her, nodded. He unlocked the door, and she climbed into the back seat without a word. As he drove off, he tried to make small talk, asking her where she was headed and if she was all right. But the woman only responded with brief one-word answers, her voice distant and strange. Something about the woman began to unsettle Mark. She was eerily still, and he could barely make out her features in the rearview mirror. The rain made the night even more disorienting, and his unease grew with every mile. After driving for several minutes in silence, Mark glanced into the mirror again, and his blood ran cold. The woman wasn't there. He slammed on the brakes and looked around frantically. The back seat was empty. The woman had vanished without a trace. He hadn't heard the door open or felt the car shift. She had simply disappeared. Mark's heart raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. He sat there for several moments, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his skin crawl. Outside, standing in the rain, was the woman. She was staring at him from the side of the road, just as she had been before. Mark hit the gas and sped off, not daring to look back. When he finally got home, he locked his doors and spent the rest of the night wide awake, haunted by the image of the woman in white. He never drove that road again. Later, he learned from a friend that there had been reports of a hitchhiker on that same highway, a woman who had been killed in a car accident years ago. She was said to appear on rainy nights, seeking rides from unsuspecting drivers. But once they let her in, she always disappeared before reaching her destination. Story 3. The Crying in the Walls. Marissa and her husband Jason were thrilled when they moved into their dream home, an old Victorian-style house that had been standing for more than a century. The house was beautiful but had a few issues: creaky floors, odd drafts, and a basement that always seemed colder than the rest of the house. But they didn't mind. They were too excited to start their new life together. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. They settled in and began renovating parts of the house that needed work. It wasn't until one rainy night that Marissa first heard the crying. She had just gone to bed when a soft, muffled sobbing reached her ears. It seemed to be coming from the walls. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the crying persisted. Marissa got up and walked around the room, pressing her ear to the walls. The sobbing was faint but unmistakable. She woke Jason, who groggily dismissed it as the wind. But Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, she searched the house, looking for any signs of animals trapped in the walls or pipes that might be making strange noises. But she found nothing. Over the next few nights, the crying grew louder. It would start in the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, and seemed to come from different parts of the house. Sometimes it sounded like a child crying, other times like a woman weeping softly. The sound sent chills down Marissa's spine. One night, after the crying had woken her again, she decided to follow the noise. She crept down the hall, flashlight in hand, trying to pinpoint the source. The crying led her to the basement. Marissa's stomach twisted with dread as she descended the stairs, the sobs growing louder with each step. When she reached the bottom, the crying suddenly stopped. The basement was freezing, and the silence was thick and heavy. Marissa stood there, heart pounding, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the basement remained still. The next morning, she told Jason about the crying again, but he laughed it off. However, Marissa was determined to get to the bottom of it. She did some research on the history of the house and discovered something chilling. Decades ago, a woman had lived there with her young daughter. One rainy night, the woman's husband had left and never returned. Heartbroken and alone, the woman had locked herself and her daughter in the basement. They were found weeks later, both dead. Marissa realized the sobbing she had been hearing wasn't just her imagination. It was the ghosts of the mother and daughter, trapped in their grief, reliving their final moments every night. The crying continued until the day they finally moved out, leaving the house and its ghosts behind. On a rainy night, the world outside feels distant and strange, and these stories serve as a reminder that sometimes things lurking in the shadows aren't just a trick of the mind. They're real, and they're watching.